Hey everybody, this is Jonathan, and this is a RealTalk episode of Trivial Warfare. That means there is no trivia, there is no frivolity, there are no co-hosts. It's just me laying down what I consider to be some real talk. So if you don't care about my opinions or don't like me very much, then you probably don't want to listen to this. If you think I might have something worth saying, then by all means, stick around. This is a little essay that I've written, and I'm sharing it with you. It is called, I Wasn't Ready for DragonCon. I just got back from Atlanta in DragonCon 2019 a few days ago. It was an amazing experience, but sadly, I have to admit that it wasn't an experience I was ready for. That's a thought that kept coming back to me as I walked around what felt like miles and miles of hotel interiors, exteriors, and skyways. It came back to me again and again as I saw people in cosplay and I tried to talk to people. You see, I always resisted being labeled as a nerd. At the same time that I was reading Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman as a preteen, I did my best to avoid traditional nerdy pursuits like the chess club or the science club. At the same time that I was spending my high school afternoons practicing and studying trivia for a contest called Brain Brawl, I didn't want to be associated with those super nerds who did things like attended Star Trek conventions, or even people who talked about that show in public. I did so much to stunt my own personality and my own success in my teens and 20s with the simple goal of wanting to be something other than a nerd. I intentionally avoided doing homework or studying for tests so that it was harder to label me as a nerd because I didn't have good grades. You see, I wasn't ready for DragonCon. I've talked a little bit before about how my relationship with Chris and his constant thoughtfulness was a big part of the reason that I was able to break out of this. Chris used to invite me to join him in small groups to play board games all the time. He knew in his heart that I would enjoy it if I would just give it a try. At the same time, I was actively trying to maintain my distance from it. There was no way that I could maintain my thin veil of plausible deniability about being a nerd if I chose to go and play nerdy board games with a bunch of nerds, even if they were my friends. Finally, after years of being asked, I decided I'd give it a try. So I joined my friends and played these inarguably nerdy games like Arkham Horror and Munchkin, and I enjoyed myself tremendously. I realized for the first time in my life that coming together to play these games was only half of the experience. The truth that I had discovered is that these games were simply an excuse for people to get together and enjoy each other's company. I remember crying to myself on the way home that night as I berated myself for being so damned stubborn and stupid. My heart was angry at my mind for its poor decision-making. All of those years of deep personal loneliness that I endured were a waste. I realized that for the first time. My pride, my need to separate myself from being a nerd, had created pain for me that had never needed to happen. My community of friends was already out there. They were living their lives without the forced disconnect from people that I had. I was not ready for DragonCon. A few years back, I still struggled with a painful degree of introversion. I would try and play it off, but I was really afraid of meeting new people and engaging without running away. I still struggle with this to a lesser degree. After meeting somebody in that first wave of an initial conversation, I'm always looking for an exit route. And sometimes I cut off conversations prematurely just because I'm worried that the conversation's about to die and I'm super uncomfortable with that. So I use escape routes to prevent being stuck. I don't want to be stuck. I've told the story of my first podcasting conference a number of times. It was New Media Expo 2015. And the second night, there was a pool party at the SLS Hotel and Casino. I didn't know what to do. Were people actually going to be in the pool? How much of a quote-unquote pool party is this? How am I supposed to dress for this? What do I do? I already had a hard enough time just talking to people I don't know. I was going to be surrounded by people I didn't know. What do I do? I remember parking in the garage next door to the hotel and finding that I could look down at the pool area from the garage. I must have stood on those stairs for a good 30 minutes looking down at the pool, trying to work up the courage to go down into this party where I didn't know anybody other than the 3 or 4 people that I had forced myself to talk to at the opening night party the night before. You see, it's tough for me because I never feel more lonely than I do when I'm in a crowd of people that I don't know. I feel isolated. I feel separate and not good enough. And loneliness is one of my triggers. Loneliness is something that I've dealt with a lot in my life. And it's hard when you have a tendency to isolate yourself. So I dove in with both feet. And I ended up having a fun conversation with a few people. Then I ran into somebody that I'd met the night before, and one thing led to another, and we ended up leaving the party together to go cruise the strip and find something fun to do. You see, this period of my life was so transformational to me. Every single action was new and foreign. The idea of going to a party and hanging out, it wasn't something I had any knowledge in, any skill in. It made me nervous just thinking about it. I was building new neural networks with every step I took. Later, as I went to other conferences, I had huge amounts of help from extroverted friends like Ramona Rice, who I love dearly. She would literally meet people all day long and then bring them back to me as I sat kind of quietly or kind of doing my own thing. And I'd met so many people because Ramona met them and then introduced them to me. She was so helpful. After a couple of years, I went through a significant change. I was able to do it all alone eventually. Walk into a party alone, it's not a deal breaker anymore. Hell, most of the time if I go to a party where I don't know anybody, I can make a couple of friends now. People who have seen me in action at a place where I don't know anybody pick on me, and they scoff at the idea that I am or ever was an introvert. They don't believe me. I have come a long way. I was not ready for DragonCon. One of the most beautiful and impressive things that I saw at DragonCon last weekend was a real embodiment of radical acceptance. I commented to Ben and to my brother Michael that the church should be attending this event and taking notes on what they are supposed to be teaching. In fact, I said that they should be sponsoring the event and having a prominent table where they can give out necessities for free, like water and snacks. My brother, who's been to DragonCon a number of years, told me instead they go the opposite route and they go picketing outside. Radical acceptance is hard. It definitely wasn't my starting point a few years ago. The desire I mentioned earlier to avoid being seen as a nerd was based so much on being a judgmental asshole. I didn't want to be like all of those nerds because I thought I was better than them. I saw them as beneath me. Michael and I haven't been able to spend much time together in a meaningful way in the last few years. We operate in different circles. We live far enough apart to where we don't ever run into each other. And as we talked about radical acceptance and how impressed I was at the way the community maintained harmony. He looked at me like I had grown a third head. See, Michael knew me at my worst. He hasn't seen the opportunity. He hasn't had the opportunity to see the change and the growth that's occurred in the past few years. See, I was not ready for DragonCon. At least, not until recently. I've learned so much over the last few years about accepting people and even about loving people. I've learned so much about being wrong and about assuming that my voice was the most important one in the room. In the last few years, I've learned how to really listen to people and how to respect other people's opinions, even and especially when they're different than mine. I don't respect them in comparison to mine. I don't judge them based on whether they're as good as mine. I listen to them and I consider them a valuable contribution. Instead, I've learned to listen to them and consider them a valuable contribution to a conversation. Mostly, I've learned to see people, as whole people. I've learned more about exploring their point of view and to respect their thought processes and their decisions and not worry about whether it's what I would do. If I had attended DragonCon in previous years, I would not have loved it. I would have found myself judging the people around me and looking down on them. I would have stood apart, aloof, hiding my own fear of being rejected, hiding my own fear of being alone, behind a wall of confidence that seemed to welcome being alone. I would have been alone in a sea of people, living in my own personally constructed cell. But this was not previous years. This year, my first year, I soaked it in. I soaked in the ways that people accepted each other and even celebrated those who dared to go the extra mile. The nerdier you were, the more out there you were, the more daring you were, the more people enjoyed you. I soaked in the sheer joy of being surrounded by people who enjoyed being who they are publicly for the whole world to see. I enjoyed talking to my brother and relating to him with love and respect. This was an awesome experience for me, and I'm glad that this year, in my first year, that I was finally ready for DragonCon. Thank you so much for listening. If you've run across this and you're not a regular listener of the show, you can actually hear the live show that we recorded with the McElroy brothers. That's episode 234 on the main feed, and I'm sure you'll get a big kick out of that. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a marvelous week. This is Jonathan. Goodbye.